right, hello and welcome to the GameDevShow. Today we've got a big crowd and it should be a lot of fun. We got a couple really interesting topics to talk about, and actually we got like a huge list of things to talk about today. So welcome, we got Yori, Andrew, Greg, Paul, and Story down there in the corner, or Story's younger AI version of himself that's hiding out down there in the corner. So how's everybody doing today?
Doing well.
Doing well.
Good. And then if you're here with us in chat, please just say hello and let us know how you're doing as well, I guess. So lots and lots of stuff to talk about. Last week, we were going over some of the changes in Unity 2023.2. And I think we'll get more into some of those, some of the things that we didn't get to cover yet. And then Jason's got a giant list of interesting stuff that I think we could talk about. And Greg had an asset that's going on Flash Deal later tonight that he showed me and I really thought was pretty interesting. And I saw a video by another one of his friends that was explaining it even more. I thought we should definitely talk about that as well. And a lot of people apparently have it. I was talking to students in the multiplayer course right before this, and about a third or half of them already had it, didn't realize they had it, had never tried it, probably got it in a bundle, and now they're going to go check it out. But it was going on sale for, I think, 70% off. I forgot the name. What was the name of that one? Editor or something?
Ultimate Editor Enhancement or something like that.
Yeah, it looked really cool. Is that have you guys tried that before? Is that one you guys have seen? I'll pull up the page. I think I've got it here. I'm just curious. It's like a built-in with the Ultimate Editor. Yeah, I already have the tab open. I'm gonna share it real quick. It looked pretty cool because it looked like just another like general productivity type tool, kind of like Odin Inspector, where you just pop it in and it makes some things faster, adds context menus, and does a bunch of fast building and stuff. So is this something you guys have seen before or used?
Not that I recall, no.
I own it, turns out. Probably. I have not used it.
I wonder if it was one of those Unity sales that you got a bundle and, yeah, apparently I own it as well.
Yeah, that is my guess that a lot of people got
apparently
this.
I own it too,
yeah. So I think I'm not sure if I own it just on a different account or what, but I got to find out and try it out. If not, I'm going to grab it on the Flash Deal because it did look pretty cool. It had a lot of just simple little features for ease of use and speeding things up, especially for level building. And it seemed like it kind of combined a couple other assets into one thing. So I want to try it out and see if it's actually as cool as it looked in that video. But
one thing I do want to point out though is I was watching. Greg posted his mastermind group on a stream, so you could watch it when he's talking about it. And one of the people in that group talked about how the feature they liked about that asset was that it had like shortcuts that you could see for like jumping different elements. Well, in the latest version of Unity, I was playing around with all the submenus and settings, and there's actually a panel for that. There's like a new, I've not seen it's new in some new version of Unity. I don't know when it was added, but you can add a strip bar at the bottom of the entire editor, and it shows you context-based shortcuts for whatever actions you're currently performing. So it'll show you like the classics, like Control-Shift-F and whatever to jump to different. It like brings them up at the bottom as you go. It's like, oh, that's how. I don't know if anyone else just found that, but that's.
Can you screen share and show that?
Sure. Let me pull up an editor.
And while he's doing that, Yori will like the fact that asset has autosave.
Yeah, that's literally what I wanted to say. That it's literally the list of tools already sold me on the first item. Literally, the first item on the list is autosave. And a lot of other things that are really useful here that are honestly insane, that they are not in the default Unity editor. We had a conversation in JSON Story server regarding Unreal and features that it has compared to Unity. And one of the things that came up is that when an editor crashes, you lose progress. Invariably, you may have been doing something that caused a crash. get it to happen. And when you reopen an editor in Unity, it doesn't remember the full context of what you had, and it loses some of the progress that you had. Scenes have a backup file that you can kind of access and do things with, but it's not a default behavior. The scene that you lost is not automatically restored. Whereas
that's one of my most popular videos, by the way, telling people how to grab that scene before they reopen the editor and lose all those changes.
Yeah, but in Unreal, first off, they have autosave. So every time you get notified with like 15 seconds to cancel the autosave in case you really, really, really need to do something that you don't want to autosave. But it will autosave for you regularly. And the version control is also better in case you do need to roll back. And on top of that, when an editor closes, regardless of if it's a crash or not, it asks you on the next opening, do you want to restore all the opened windows that you had to the exact same way that they were? Exact same selected items, exact same everything, which is amazing for restoring progress. Like you immediately go back to the context you were on, something that Unity doesn't give you. So seeing things like that, autosave, etc., is a good thing to have. And I'm surprised that Unity just doesn't integrate it into the engine itself.
It is. But what precipitated that conversation was I'm doing an Unreal course from GameDev TV, and I'm just astonished at how many times, like if you add a new function and you want it to show up in Blueprint, you have to close the editor, rebuild, and then reopen the editor before it will show up. And I'm like, that's something that seems like it should have been worked out months ago. It reminded me back in the 90s, there was an email thread going around, a joke thread about what if your car functioned like Windows, and one of the things was it would just randomly just stop for no apparent reason. And you would accept this as normal. I feel like this is one of those things that Unreal developers just accept as normal, that you have to close the editor, rebuild from the source code editor, and then reopen your Unity editor every time you add like a new input action or add a new constructor or who knows what.
Yeah.
The lack of the scene view is the one that I'm still like mind boggled by. It's just like that's so obviously required. having to like detach your pawn and repeat back is like it's so much extra work. It's frustrating.
Yeah. So just to clarify on that, because this is literally the biggest argument point I have against Unreal Engine, and I have been looking at the source to try and see like where do I even begin to address it. In Unreal, you have a scene view, just like they call it a viewport, but you have a scene view just like in Unity, where you can fly around, you can add things, you can offer your level and content, etc. But when you enter play mode, it automatically moves the camera to follow the pawn that you're playing with. And even though you can eject and fly around without possessing a pawn during gameplay, it doesn't clearly go back to the same spot, and you cannot, under any circumstance, have two viewports where one of them can fly around and one of them can follow the pawn. And that ruins the ability to debug gameplay properly. They have other tools that compensate for it, but it's not a replacement, and it's a huge hassle. If you just want to see what the platform does as soon as you start pressing play, if it's like off screen or something, you can't do that because it starts automatically following the pawn. Even if you disable pawn following, which does help, now you can't play. You can't press buttons and see how the platform reacts to it because you either don't play or you play following your character. Annoying. So yeah. Something that Unity has an app on Unreal, and it's a really stupid way of having an app.
Yeah, I'm just getting flashbacks to using old Unreal and making a change and then waiting half an hour and then reopening my editor once it recompiled, reopening the games. All these things like Unity. I remember when I first started with Unity, I was just shocked. I was like, wait a minute, I can just change code and press play and it just fucking works. And I can even change code while I'm playing and it just works. I was totally.
Sometimes
I ever do that anymore.
On that. That
I don't ever do that anymore. But when I saw that I could at first, I was like, "That's amazing." Then I realized that's not quite as amazing. It's about the same as edit and continue. Like it kind of works sometimes, and but a lot of times you still got to recompile. But the compilation times always blew me away. I was so used to 2 hour long builds.
The one that I have really enjoying, I admit I'm having way too much fun with it, is apparently literally nobody knows about the domain reloading checkbox. Like I know I've said this a few times now, but it's so funny. I keep finding people every week now. I look for it. Now whenever I see someone in Unity, I'm like, do you know about this checkbox? And I'm like, I'm saving so many people so many hours like every week just by pointing it out. It's so mind-boggling to me. This seems to be the biggest secret, and it's like a pretty native feature at this stage.
Can you explain it to everybody here and for the couple people who might not know what it is?
I just want to point out we've been talking about I think we've brought it up over 10 times throughout the streams in the past, but let's do it again.
Still people are still being surprised by it. So obviously you modify code, you press play, you test your build. And Unity does its best to ensure that when you press play, you get as close as it can do in editor a representation of what a build would be like. And it does that by flushing and reloading the domain, reloading the scene, and doing the whole lot kind of brand new, which is awesome if you're changing code and want things to work correctly. It is not awesome if you're like designing a level and nudging some rectangles, and it's like, oh, you nudged a rectangle of a platform 3 inches to the left. Let's rebuild the code base. It's like that's a lot of work that you don't really need in that exact moment. And so what a lot of people don't realize is you can go into the settings and there's a little single checkbox, and you could say, actually, don't reload the domain unless I modify scripts. But you optionally also reload the scene or not reload the scene. And then you end up with a scenario where when you press play, it is nearly instant, providing you haven't modified a script. It just means that you can do any of the level design work instantly, like legitimately the difference between waiting 20, 30 seconds sometimes versus press button and it just starts playing. Yeah, so it's a big difference.
Isn't there a caveat with that, though, about statics? That it doesn't.
Well, that's the domain, right? Literally, like if you don't reload the domain, you're not going to have it refresh the state of variables that are things like static variables. So it can be an issue in sort of weird, wacky ways. But again, the point would be is if you're using it to design the level stuff, you shouldn't really be modifying stuff like that too much. And again, it's not like you can't always just refresh the domain whenever you want. It's just having the additional option is quite nice.
Where is this magical button that you just?
So in the project settings, editor tab, and then you scroll to the bottom, and there would be enter play mode options, I think it's called.
There it is.
Now it's not very intuitive. So to be clear, there's 3 checkboxes, and Unity, in their infinite wisdom, make it unnecessarily complicated. So the first checkbox enables the other checkboxes. And that basically says you've now toggled the ability to modify the way it runs, and then you checkbox the ones you want on. So, long story short, you checkbox the first one to say enable settings, and then of the remaining settings, you checkbox the ones you want. In this case, you want it to reload scene, you don't want it to reload domain. So, TLDR, checkbox the top one, skip the domain one, checkbox the scene one, and then you're basically telling it refresh the scene.
Yeah. Just to clarify, though, on the scene versus the domain, when they made a blog post talking about this feature, they also profiled how long it takes to do each of these steps. And from Unity's own words, 90% of the time that you're spending to enter play mode is refreshing the domain. So just unticking the domain is 90% of the time. If you have been waiting 5 seconds, you'll wait half a second. The other part, the scene reloading, is only 10% of the time. So even if you disable it, sorry, it's 8% technically. If you disable it, you come down to 2% out of the original number if you have both disabled. But the idea behind those reloadings is that you don't retain state between your runs. You want every run to be deterministic. You don't want things to break because in the last run, something weird happened. So there is an advantage to having a domain refresh, except doing it for everything is unnecessary. Sometimes you have something that you set up once and you'll never, ever want to redo it because it's like some search table optimization or whatever that's not going to change. Or a calculation that you're doing like at the start, calculating like all 100 levels XP worth that you're going to need and you didn't do it in the editor for some reason. You can let that run once and then you don't want to reload it. So by disabling domain reloading, you can save on the calculations for all the future runs, which is great. It's fantastic. If you do want to take control over this, there is initialize runtime on load, and it lets you, it's an attribute that you can put over any static method. And then it will call that method as soon as the game is supposed to load. There are different stages, like before a scene loads, before the application loads, etc., etc. So you have to choose carefully what needs when you need it. But this will let you reset the things that you need to reset. This is the static staying between states. This is the method that lets you reset it only for the things that you need to reset. So yeah, it's good stuff.
Well, I want to share the thing that Story was talking about earlier because it's up on my screen right now. Let's see if I can make it bigger. Just tell this.
I put a second image that's more zoomed in because I had a feeling you'd want to do that. This is obviously a bit, the layout's a bit wacky because as per our current discussion, if you're not editing your layouts, I don't know why you're. That's what it's for, right? There's loads of different choices. So here's a zoomed in version. It's basically there's a little strip at the bottom of settings that you can. It's kind of a bit low pixelated there, but you get the idea. Effectively, what's cool about that is it's context driven. So as you're moving around the editor, it'll be like, oh, here's things you can do here, which is kind of cool.
And this is just a new option you can enable?
Yeah, I basically, because it's been a while, right? So I'm taking a page out of Uri's book, and I was like, you know what? I never actually just look at what Unity adds sometimes. I kind of forget because, quite frankly, it's just there's so much stuff that randomly gets added. So I basically went through every tab and page in the settings of the latest version of Unity and was like, what's this button do? Okay, hover over the tooltip. Let's read through it. And I found a whole bunch of like little settings like this that I'm like, oh, I want that. That's nice. I'll put that up. So,
yeah, this is a new one for me, so I want to try it out.
As for what checkbox and where, I don't know because it was literally I went through and clicked a bunch of stuff. So you'll have to go hunt for that one yourself. But
good picture settings.
Yeah, but I know it's in the Windows or something. There's like an option for tooltip or something.
I think it's in the preferences, but I don't remember which tab. It's not per project though, if I recall correctly. Yeah, but this is one of the good stuff that Unity keeps adding. They keep trying to make the editor better. There is stuff that like will slightly kill the performance. One thing that I was really surprised by, there is a freaking checkbox for, do you want to have tooltips on fields you hover over in game mode, in play mode? Like, you wouldn't have tooltips when you hover over elements unless you have the checkbox ticked. And apparently it impacts editor performance, so. Yeah. Just one of those interesting things that you wouldn't expect to have a checkbox for. So, speaking of UI elements and all that, do you want to get into UI toolkit maybe?
Ooh, does anybody? Let's do it.
So I've been meaning to get into this only from the context of the Unity changelog because they've added something new in 2023.2 to UI toolkit, which I think is worthy of mentioning. But Story, I know that you have recently been exploring it. So do you want to take it from there and then we'll just tack that thing on the end?
Yeah, sure. I'll also say that it's another one of those things that again, so as someone in the chat pointed out, I have sort of been trawling through Twitch recently. I'm doing a bit of research on different things, and one of them has been, I realized you fall into your own bubbles with people you know and the content you create or produce or whatever, and so it's very hard to know what the temperature is on certain things, settings and defaults and expectations. And so sometimes I'll just go on like Twitch under the game dev section and go, what are people doing? How do they use the editor? What stuff do they know? Do they not know? What are the common mistakes I say? And just sort of looking through stuff. And I just bring it up to say that other than that tooltip, the trick we mentioned, a lot of people don't even know, like new people, again, understandably so, because we're coming from experience and doing this. A lot of people don't know that Unity's on iteration 3 of their UI system and iteration 2 of their input system. And so they're using the out-of-the-box solution, which still defaults to the old version of both things. And so, yeah, it's just fascinating to me that a lot of people don't use those. And it occurred to me, I'm at the point now where it's been around long enough that I should be able to use the new one with at least 50% the efficiency I can of the old one. Right now, that is not true. I'm very, very slow setting stuff up with the new one. I can do it, but it's very tedious to go through the process. And it's just going to take practice for it to become as default for me. I do think it's very powerful. It looks really good. And it's actually the ability to like live edit stuff as you go is fascinatingly like I forgot how nice it was coming from the WPF days, just to be able to like look at it and go, oh, I can add animation effects while I'm looking at it and hovering the mouse around the UI, rather than having to go back to code and write a do-train sequence just to modify a button animation. Not to mention performance improvements and all the other stuff. It's not perfect. It is missing features. The whole world space thing being a big issue. But in general, I find the out of the box experience, by the sheer nature of having an on hover and on select event that's very easy to set up, means you get a very responsive feeling UI. It's very clean, it's very simple, and adding things like gradients and stuff tend to get easier because, again, it's basically a drawing graphics library. You can literally draw your own stuff on top of it. Yeah, it's very nice, and you can make stuff, I think, that looks a lot nicer with it than having to manually go through a whole lot of steps doing it the other way. I'm still starting with it, but I do think it's, even for editor stuff, that's especially, a lot of people don't realize, again, Unity's own tools are used for their own tools. So the editor that you use for Unity is written originally in the same tools you were using, IMGUI, and then they rewrote it to use the new one, and so you can use that too. And so, especially for editor tooling, you can add all the fancy effects and hover effects and animations. It's just people don't really do that. So there's a lot of fun toys there that I just have to kind of work into my workflow.
So, I'm curious, have you found anything aside from the live updates that it's able to do that's giving you like an extra benefit or boost right now?
Data binding, big one. Data binding is a huge one. Anybody who's ever worked in any kind of MVVM style architecture, or basically anything where you're, back in the early days of WinForms, for example, one of the most common forms of desktop applications was stuff that's a glorified sprite sheet editor. Think of how many applications for banking and systems and information, they're all just some fancy
access in Excel.
Yeah, you're basically building a localized my app version of Excel for what you're doing. And so you regularly had tables and grids, or the other being a file system, right? You wanted to reference a file system and have a tree structure. Now, you could go ahead and build a tree. Now, the tree is not that hard, same with the grid. You're just basically saying add row for each row, add column entry, and you build it up manually. But when you're modifying the values, there's a lot of expected behavior there of like, okay, delete row element, then go to the list, iterate through, remove entry, and blah, 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 or likewise modify value. Now, you could write all the code for this yourself, but the context of data binding means you can basically say, in memory, this chunk of array of stuff equals this stuff. And if you modify this visual thing, refresh the data in memory to match, and vice versa, which makes things a lot easier because you can pull data from a web source and go show, and then modify values and save. So data binding is a huge deal because it means you don't have to individually write subscription events for every single on off and back and forth and blah, blah,
blah. What's that data binding experience like nowadays in the latest version? Can you just say you've never done, or maybe done like light little bit of binding data? If everybody doesn't know, you're essentially taking a piece of data, hooking it up to a UI element, and either one way binding it, so data is coming from the data, or so it's going from the data to the UI, or maybe sometimes from an input to the data, or doing a two-way binding where it can update both ways, where the UI can update the data can update the UI, and you're essentially hooking that up. But what's that process like in UI elements now? You're just creating a class that you then bind to a style sheet or a sheet or something, or can you give like the high level?
Well, it's they thankfully do things a lot like other YAML standards, so they're not reinventing the wheel too much, which is a good thing. For example, if you bind to an object, you can effectively use dot syntax to kind of drill down to elements inside of something you want. So if you had a array of characters and characters had names and ability scores or something, you could just do character.name, character.ability, character.description. And if you bind to the root level to character, you don't have to go in and say character.name equals character.name, character.label whatever equals, it'll bind to the appropriate sub elements from the collection, which is quite nice.
Yeah. Just something that I wanted to clarify for people who are not familiar with the new Unity UI toolkit. God, it's a long name. Unity originally used IMGUI, which is immediate mode GUI, which is literally every frame, the editor draws everything. It maintains no state. Immediate mode means it's calling the commands and immediately drawing them. So it was really, really difficult to save on performance because you couldn't build a state. Every time you had to call draws for everything. The idea behind the new UI toolkit, which is the new integration for the editor, which they've been gradually moving the entire editor to, is that they can construct the way they want the UI to look once and then cache it and never need to redraw it unless something changes, which is a big improvement, but it also comes with changes to how code needs to run now. So because it's no longer immediate mode, which means every frame you start with a blank slate, you actually have to make sure that the state is always correct. There's nothing like this part changing without the other part changing. So this is the main performance advantage within the UI toolkit, which is why they've been trying to move the editor to it. So it's going to have a far better and smoother experience, because frankly, there are a lot of Unity UI panels and each of them takes performance as they try to draw in immediate mode. And on top of that, they want to give users a nicer experience in creating editor windows. So one of the big things with the UI toolkit is that you can construct style sheets and data binding and all that for your own UI stuff instead of you having to use immediate mode as well, which is far more friendly to designers, because big teams have designers and designers don't necessarily learn Unity UI design. They use other tools such as Figma or other web editing tools. And the Unity style sheets actually borrow from that design. So it's rather identical for the designers coming in.
And style sheets are infinitely better, by the way, as well, for people not familiar. Because normally when you style something, not only is it unique to the style, but the beauty of style sheets is they can compound. So you can literally make a style that's just the border style, or a style that's just a particular layout. And so I'm more familiar with this from web design things, but oftentimes you would say like button left aligned big and then hero or something, and each word would mean something, and you sort of stack compound these different things, which means you can do a lot of customization where you can have buttons that are designed for different use cases, and then just depending on the prefix you use, which can be added and removed at runtime. And then on top of all of that, even the layout elements, you can make your own, and they're kind of like prefabs, but they're more powerful because the idea would be you can nest them indefinitely. So if you have a custom styled component, example of this I always use is a line item for a list or a avatar. If you've got a character that constitutes a name, a health bar, and image of the face or something, that like chunk of data, the model's identical every time. You're basically saying this thing renders a character. Now, it might render a character as a circle with a health bar around the rim of the circle. It might render a character as a bottom left bar with all of the details in it, but functionally, it's the same thing. And so you can define a thing that's a character renderer and then drop it in the appropriate places, and all the binding hooks up. And if you change your mind how you want it to render, you can swap it out for another thing that matches the same contract. So a lot of the ability to sort of atomize your stuff and then reuse elements is considerably easier with this sort of like nested hierarchy approach than manually coding each element.
Yeah, and I just want to point out that while you can do this in UGUI, the exact point is that you don't have to, because Unity already did that for you. This is the value in it. Another thing that they are considerably making efforts to is including all the elements that people expect to exist when you're coming into a UI toolkit. So things like tab views, etc., are things that are including by default now. They had components for it in UGUI, but UGUI is only for play mode usage, and you can't make editor tabs with it, which is ideally what you want to do. They want to have developers creating easier experiences for themselves, because they can't make all the editor tools you'll ever need for you. So by giving you the tools to make your own editor tools more easily, they're hoping that the value of the editor will increase.
Oh, and one other thing, again, very small details, but a lot of these things compound and add up in a very satisfying way. It may sound silly, but whenever I designed with IMGUI, could have just been me, but the way I approached it every time was I used image as my default object type, and I would basically paint it neon different colors, and I would block my layouts using image. I would sort of lay it all out so I could see different colored bars, so I could check the scales positioning and percentage whatever. But the native sort of unit in the UI toolkit is a visual element, which is a fancy way of saying div for those with the web background. It basically means an empty container, and an empty container can be filled with whatever it is you want. It can be styled to be a border or have a color or whatever, and you can nest them effectively indefinitely, which means if you're like me and like to just block the whole UI out as a series of bright colors to go, right, conceptually this is where things would be at these sizes, and test your scaling first, you can do that very, very easily with just empty boxes, and then have a generic single class style sheet that says colorful box with different colors. And even the prototyping process is far faster, I find. So while like I said earlier, I'm infinitely slower because I have extension methods built on top of all of the original IAM GUI stuff that automates a lot of things for me. There is potentially I will be a lot faster when I finally switch over to the newer toolkit. But yeah, it's just when you've been doing something the same way for years, it's going to slow you down when you switch over.
Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but the UI toolkit does have a preview area without even entering play mode, right? You just build the UI and you can immediately try it out. This is
you can literally press preview and it'll hover and do all the animations even without switching the window.
Yeah, great. This is the good stuff. Yeah, for the UI, because in Unity's current approach, UGUI for runtime, you're basically stuck with either editing in play mode and then losing your changes, or editing in edit mode, then entering play mode, having the domain reload we just discussed about earlier, and then you can try it out, assuming it didn't break anyway.
Also, even just changes, again, these are small things, but they really add up. If you have an image layout a certain way and you're like, actually, let's try the border this way with different sizes and stuff, and you change a bunch of things and then change your mind, you either have to have made sure you've done a backup prefab, revert your commit, or go through a whole lot of various different stages. With this, it can just be a style, and you can say, delete one word or add back that one word. You can keep making modifications so easy to test new ideas without destructively changing older stuff.
For that, I'm going to say I personally just have prefabs in my UIs, so it's not that much of a deal breaker for me because you can duplicate a prefab and just edit the content. And if you follow the same structure, like you can do that. I said you can do that with UGUI, and I've been doing it the style that is compatible with how the data binding does. So I would name my elements the exact same way and have drag and drop fields for it in UGUI, but it's not the same in terms of iteration speed because not having to enter play mode is by itself the biggest win here.
Especially things like compound stuff. That's kind of what I mean. Like, for example, if I have elements that are distributed a certain way, I might want to set margin and padding. And that margin and padding may be consistent for any kind of interactable button or element or whatever. And so if I want to tweak that at a more global level, or if I want to change, make different presets of that, again, I can, but the option to do that would be copy the prefab again, modify the values, and then redo the whole thing and like have different variants versus literally a word, a single word I can remove or add, right? Like it's much, much easier.
Yeah. You've definitely convinced me to give it another try. I know last time I dove into UI Toolkit, I looked at it and I was like, this is not really going to help at all. But after everything you guys have been saying and looking at the page a little bit here, it does seem like they've gotten rid of most of the pain. Because before, it felt a lot like Silverlight 1.0 to me, where it was like, oh, here, go write a shitload of stuff to accomplish the same little thing that was one line. It seems like they've switched it around, though, now. And now it's you write one line and it does the thing, but then there's also these other tools. I mean, I would not one-to-one, but closer to that. And then there's tools to bind this stuff up. But it seems like your eyes got more.
yeah. As soon as you said it, like
it's still like 3 files and lots of stuff. Yeah, there's still a lot of setup frustrating.
In their defense, they've added editor tool items like context menu items that create multiple files for you with the exact same setup as required to save you the time on that. But it's still a lot of boilerplate. And on top of that, there are still features which prevent it from being fully runtime ready. So to clarify, it works in runtime now. It originally wasn't even a design goal for it, but now it can. So if you make UI with it, you can. There are features that are missing if you are using UGUI and you want to switch to that, and you should know what you're getting into. if you want to use this for your game. I know a lot of people are listening and are like, yeah, easier UI making for my game. Cool. But there are things you literally can't do with it yet.
What are the core most important ones?
The
No
world's
shaders. No shaders is the biggest one. You can make fancy. I want to stress this because this is the single most effective way to draw players' attentions. Making big flashy things that are like pretty. You can't do that. No UI particles, no UI like animations that actually change how each pixel looks. You can make image animations by having like static images and animating them. That's not the same. You can have moving elements. It's really hard to add that. The animation support within UI Toolkit is really poor. right now.
Well, okay, a little asterisk on that one, I will say. I would argue that if you are unfamiliar with animation at all, if you're not really doing, and if you wanted to animate an element with normal IM GUI, you have to probably get a tweening library, probably call some functions and set it up. The difference of the way it works with UI Toolkit is it uses a transitioning concept, which basically means if you've got a style that looks a certain way and a style that looks another way, and you switch the style, it will automatically animate every value automatically for you from one to the other. So hovers, bounces, having things slide in from off frame, all of this is literally automatic as opposed to having to write a tween for it. So, well, yes, more advanced stuff, 100%. But for the native stuff, I'd argue for people who don't even do that much, who don't animate their UI elements at all, they get it for free, like literally without doing any work whatsoever.
Well, I wouldn't say much about that because the type of UI animations that I am looking for are not available.
We are talking about different things.
Yeah,
For clarity
yeah.
here, I'm talking about the average game. Your eyes talking about that classic mobile game, awesome, over the top, super amazing effects that you cannot do any of that at the moment.
Not even mobile games. The platforms that are on the high end use a lot of that as well. If you looked at UIs like Final Fantasy 16 or dare I say Anthem, which had a really over-the-top UI, I have no idea what they were thinking. A lot of that is really difficult to create in UI Toolkit. You lose a lot of things. One more thing that is crucially missing from UI Toolkit for gameplay usage right now is world space UI. Jason touched on that earlier. I just want to explain what this is. Usually you imagine that UI is like a window on your PC. It's looking straight at you. There is no curvature as it's looking another way, or it cannot be placed within a 3D scene because it won't look straight at you. It's not like you can put it on a door and then walk away from the door and it's no longer in your sight. It's a window laid up on top of the game view and it will not move. And you can't do that. And you also cannot create effects that express depth. You can't have an element that's farther away or a button that as you click on it, it moves like slightly backwards and back forward. All of those perspective things do not exist in UI Toolkit right now.
Although to go even one step further, seeing as we're talking about UI, might as well go the whole hog.
Sure.
So somebody mentioned, because we brought up Silverlight. Here's a fun fact about that whole pipeline. So back in ye old days, back when Unreal was called UDK, which is the development kit for Unreal. If you were doing a game in Unreal 4 or 3 around that era, you probably remember seeing a lot of the words Scaleform UI. That used to be in the bottom corner with a little logo that was the UI platform it used. A lot of people didn't realize what that was Flash games. Literally the same Newgrounds Flash games, but the way UI worked is you would make a Flash game, you would render that Flash game as your UI, and then you would fire events back and forth from that Flash game. Now, that's gone sort of the way of the dodo. We don't really do that anymore. But the principle's still there, having UI middleware, which is like a separate entity to the stuff, and you sort of render it on a canvas and interact with it. I bring this up to say, if you take a modern game like Baldur's Gate used one of these. They used something, I think it's Noesis UI, and Noesis is basically a middleware which renders to the game a canvas. And so you don't do any of the UI stuff in the engine at all. You can use the same tool in Unreal or in Unity. And what's really powerful about that, and I bring all of this background, is it uses literally the same principles as Silverlight. That used expression blend, which is what you would use back in the day for Silverlight stuff, you can literally design your UI in Expression Blend right now, which is, again, I imagine the tool they probably used for Baldur's Gate, to design a UI which has all the event binding stuff, but outside the engine. And then you effectively render this thing as almost like a video sitting on top of your game. And then you send a model of data events like the data binding we said to it on top of all of the other stuff. It has tons of benefits, tons of downsides too, but like in general, it is probably better if you've got a large team, if you have people who know web stuff. But the real benefit, more than anything else, is it's got a built-in state machine on the UI by itself. So all of the animations for things like the dice rolls and stuff doing all the cool things, all of that can be completely agnostic to your game. And you can literally have designers use timelines to design entire suites of animations with vector graphics that play and animate and change state and all that stuff. And then you just basically place it over your game at runtime, which is gorgeous. It's really clean and very straightforward.
On that note, I just wanted to bring it up because you reminded me. I've been modding different Unreal Engine games, and you literally find Flash-based like UI files. Still in modern games today, I think it's Kingdom Hearts 3, I'm not sure, that had its UI built with that. So just wanted to throw it out there. Yep.
What was the story? What was the name of that UI, and can we link to that? I've not heard of that before.
Sure. Noesis UI framework. I'm sure it's... see if I can find a link.
Yeah.
Well,
and
thanks for the stroll down memory lane. I used Silverlight for the previous incarnation of my card game. It was called Dutch Blitz back then, but I need to jump off. I have a real life meeting at work in a couple of minutes. I got to jump on. So,
all right, Greg, well, it was good having you. Yeah. Everybody go check out Highland Panic in the description and check out the asset that Greg recommended, that editor tool. You probably already have it from a bundle. Go try it out.
See y'all.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, apparently my internet quality is terrible right now. So sorry if I look like a blurry mess. I don't look quite this bad in real life. There were a couple questions. First,
I was just going to say, Corvallis' question is a good one to point out. Or
yeah, I was going to get that one. I just wanted to take the one for Powell real quick because I haven't heard his voice in a really long time, and they asked a while ago, and I assume the answer is going to be really fast. Is it possible to convert RAM to work with Unreal Engine 5?
Yeah,
and he's just disappeared. I love it. I'm gone.
No, to talk about it, we first have to finish the one asset that is showcasing behind me. This is asset that we are currently working. Then we are working on finishing the RAM new version, and then we will be creating assets for Unreal and moving Lava to Unreal, and there should be some packs and elements of RAM going to Unreal then.
Oh, so nice.
Next year. We are not giving any time frame for the Unreal assets, as we first have to finish this too for Unity.
Oh, well, that's awesome. I wasn't expecting that there was already planned, so that is great to hear. I'm sure a lot of people will be really excited. And also, you got a bunch of stuff in the Black Friday sale with the flash deals and 50% off ones, right?
Yes, there are several packs of ads that are on the sale. Go grab them. And one more add note, there is possible change of our time frame if Godot releases their marketplace.
Oh, okay. That'd be interesting. Cool. Well, yeah, hopefully that you get to use that in Unreal too. Or just build your game in Unity and use it now. Okay, so there were more questions though. Like I said, I wanted to make sure that we got to that one because I haven't heard anything for a while from Powell. But there were two. Do you guys want to take 3D Sorcery or Corvallis first?
I think I can answer the 3D Sorcery one faster first. So
let's go for it. Any tips to do better UI particles because they seem terrible currently?
Yeah. So first off, I just wanted to say the reason you can't do UI particles is a really stupid reason. But basically, the particle systems are modifying a 3D mesh, and that's all they do. And you can technically make UI appear particles appear within the UI, but the UI system, all it does is also build a mesh, and it caches that mesh. So it's not part of the UI technically. Now, what you can do is, first off, you can have a particle system as a child of any UI element, but it has to be within the same scale size as the rest of the UI. You know how the UI transform is like 100 pixels and 20 pixels. That would be the equivalent of 100 meters and 20 meters if you want to do that. Now, the other thing is, when you construct your UI, there are a lot of parameters impacting its scale, so you have to actually fully match it. So first off, the boxes have to like be gigantic, etc. If you ever made UGUI UI in Unity, you'll see that like the UI is in the scene, but it's gigantic. It's like on the XY plane, but it's huge. That's because it's actually kind of represented in the scene, but it's just not drawing in the scene. The UI canvas renderer has a mode if it's layout on top of the screen, not drawn within the scene, or you can
overlay.
Or you can set it like camera mode, which means it's like drawing relative to the camera but within the world, and then you can have UI that particles and literally any mesh. As long as it matches the UI's position. And lastly, there is world space UI, which means it's literally an object in the world, and then you can match it. So first off, you want to have the particle systems lined up and scaled properly to the way you render UI. Secondly, it's way easier to do if you just use the camera UI mode. And thirdly, if you have it in you to make custom shaders for those particles to render nicely, that would work way better for you. And if you really don't want to do any of that work, there are like 10 assets on the asset store that try to do that for you. Each one of them has their own like caveats and the way that they do things, but Unity itself works really, really fine for it. If you follow Mirza Beg on Twitter, X,
you definitely should if you don't.
Yeah, he's an amazing VFX artist. He makes a bunch of stuff. He has a lot of really good things. He actually has a post regarding doing a lot of really interesting things with UGUI, specifically particles and things that follow the cursor, and even moving windows using joints of physics, giving them actual physics and like using joints on the UI itself. It's great. I'll write down how you write Mirza Beg so you can show it to everybody. That's that for the UI particles. Now let's move to the...
I think that's a good answer. So we'll go on to Corvallis' question, who is not here for some reason to just ask it in voice. Could you use UI Toolkit in tandem with UGUI to get the best of both worlds, like Hannah Montana?
Realistically, pretty much like all the other systems, even the input, although it's not as big a deal with that one. Literally it's an object you place in the scene that renders it in the same way. It's just like you place a thing, you drag an asset into it, and it just renders onto the screen. So effectively, you can use it or not use it in the same way you can use a canvas or not use it, or use multiple canvases or use roleplay. It's another type of thing. So I will say, at least for myself, things like health bars and HUDs that don't have particles, I find, or even just your standard like pause menu, all of that stuff is infinitely easier and cleaner with UI Toolkit, but you might find yourself wanting to use the canvases for the world space stuff. So yeah. So did that answer your question?
Oh, you're silent. You're muted. You're muted, Corvallis. Somewhere, not in here. One of the many places.
Voice is too powerful for the stream.
This is what happens. You ask a question, and then suddenly when you get your answer, you pop on the screen. We just do that for you. It's automatic.
More the normal process. Thank you for
So I wanted to share the Twitter. I just dropped the link in there because I could not remember how to spell his last name. So thank you for correcting it. I kept putting it in backwards, the E and the I. But definitely go check him out. It's awesome. Good stuff.
Yeah. In regards to the UI Toolkit and UGUI, I just want to point out you lose a lot by trying to use both at once. Specifically, your entire team now has to work with two different UI sets. Maybe three if you're trying to use something that the UI Toolkit isn't fit for in the editor. But not great. Secondly, there will be feature mismatches. No, both of them don't support everything. So you're doing a lot of data build-up, data translating, etc., etc. Really, really a recipe for a bad time to try and use both. That
Yep.
said,
I'm
if you're
Stacking
going
frameworks
to
is all
challenge that
about
one
it.
simply because I think it depends what
I didn't
for.
finish. I didn't finish. The one
I wish I had a
part
fight
where I say
graphic.
it's fine. The one part where I'd say it's perfectly fine to use both is if you segment them so that the UI toolkit is only used for editor things and your GUI is only used for runtime things. In which case, you have entirely different standards of working and everything is going to be peachy keen. So
I'd still use both on a project. I don't really see too big of an issue because to me it's a matter of you've got your data sources and you've got two different ways to render that data, right? Like conceptually, if you're not, I understand there's going to be difficulty with certain standards for scalings and different things not lining up, but fundamentally, I would say that if your requirements for, like, for example, you could
Can you give like a scenario where you would use it? I think that would probably explain it best.
Well, I mean, a good example is your entire. If you have an overlay menu that contains your settings menu, your options, all of your stuff, that entire sequence of stuff can be, or your title screen where you pick your continue and your next game and all that stuff. That entire set of screens could just be turned on, used, and turned off again, right? It doesn't have to have any relationship to anything else.
So my counterpoint to that is you want to have consistent feedback on your elements when a user is interacting with a game. And if some of the UI has really nice, particles, animations that are done in shaders, etc., and the other part is like fully static image, flash in, flash out, you're going to notice.
Yeah, but your
one UI
the
is
argument
not
there
going
is
to be on the same standard as the other UI.
But that argument is entirely if you want the particle side of it. My point is, if you have a Photoshop mock-up of your UI design and you use the exact same elements in UI Toolkit for some stuff and in Canvas for another, it is visibly identical, right? There's no, all of the stuff we're talking about is different past that point.
Yeah,
but literally, in terms of making a mock-up of UI using both toolkits, they're exactly the same.
But the point of using UGUI right now is to use the features that you don't still have in UI Toolkit. I'll fully recognize that once UI Toolkit has everything, use UI Toolkit for everything. It does not. And when you use a UI, any type of kit to your advantage, you want to use all of those features to create the best experience within the means that you have. So by not using it, you're holding back on usable, high quality things that draw people's attention resources.
I agree, but that's the argument for the kit, not the question, can you use both together? And the answer is yes, you can use both together.
No, but I'm saying that if you're trying to use both together and one of them is lacking the feature, you don't have consistency. And losing the consistency is a huge deal.
I don't know. I don't see that as big an issue. Because again, it comes down to what you're going to use it for. I think for someone like me, 99.9% of my use cases will be handled by doing everything with UI Toolkit. With the one exception, I can't do world space health bars or something. And so for that, I would use canvases for world space health bars. I would ensure the styles match in terms of the literal prefabs and images and PNGs I'm using. But I would do all of the actual mouse interaction based stuff with UI Toolkit. And I don't see there'd be any stylistic or visual difference between the two.
That's kind of what I was wondering. I was thinking that might be like one of the only scenarios where you would, knowing you, that you would probably default to UI Toolkit for 99% of things and then do it for maybe the couple edge case things that you couldn't use it for right now. I don't know that I necessarily would, because UI Toolkit is still not something that I
will say all of this is,
but yeah,
this is all in the dot hypothetical for me, because like I said, for all of my pro UI Toolkit arguments, I still use IAM-GUI for everything right now.
You use UGUI, right? Or IAM-GUI for editor stuff.
Even for editor stuff, I use it for everything at the moment. I am 100% switching to UI Toolkit for editor stuff in the short term. That's something I'm aiming to do very soon, because it's definitely easier for that stuff. But as for game stuff, I am like, despite the arguments here, I'm genuinely, I don't know how production ready it would be for the kind of scale. Like realistically, if I wanted to do something fancier than Unity's out of the box solution, I would go full on Noesis UI, right? Like I wouldn't bother with a halfway house middle ground of a thing. I would either use the tools in the editor that do what I need, or I would use a third party asset that's like designed for this purpose in its entirety, that lets me use real web standards with existing stuff and like render it in the engine. I'm only saying that if you are bridging the gap and learning the stuff and getting into it, it is possible to do so. And I think if you're like me and you try to wait till everything is no longer bleeding edge, that's fine. But you might find yourself using Unity for a long time and still missing like a huge chunk of its feature set, and you can't even be moderately functional in it. I don't think it's worth waiting that long to get that far. I think you should kind of pepper this stuff in earlier into your career going forward. Because I left even input system. I only started using the new input system in the last year, but it's been technically available for quite a bit longer than that. But I've always been very cautious, and I've found in the rare cases it kind of catches up with me where it's like new projects come into me with client stuff and they're using things I haven't actually gotten around to yet because I didn't think was production ready. So I'm just trying to be a bit more aware of, don't let it lag too far behind on that stuff, basically, is what I mean.
I will say I am crazy enough to use both because I really, really like world space health bars, but I want to learn UI toolkit at the same time. So I will be doing some very weird, tiny project to hodgepodge them. So that way I get to learn, and we'll see how much of a mess it is. Because using both is 2 layers of complexity, but I really like world space health bars.
Yeah.
The one thing I would say about world space health bars is that you can kind of jury rig it using like a mesh and a shader on the health bar, and then you don't have to deal with having UI for it. Or you can do the smarter thing and just use UI toolkit for everything. But instead of doing it world space, do it layered space with that matches the world space position of the element, which is literally just a camera screen, world point to screen or whatever.
Yeah, that's what
I was
going to
ask, is it just as easy in UI toolkit as it is in
the exact same function call. You can literally call the thing camera to world to space. It has its own 0 to 1 coordinate space. The only difference is it's inverted in terms of
ups and down.
It's annoying. You have to do an annoying translation, but functionally it's 0 to 1 in exactly the same way as you would do with.
And it's the world to camera space, right?
Yes.
Screen world to screen space,
or world to screen. Okay.
Or viewport space, technically. There are different ones. Each one of them has their own advantages.
Yeah, either way, no matter what it is, you can basically get mouse point as a percentage of screen, convert it to a 0 to 1 space, and then map it to whatever UI framework is rendering. That's how they all work.
Yeah.
Sweet. So since Andrew has been really silent for a while, and there was a question here, and Andrew and Powell both have, and they both have lots of assets up there, I thought this might be a good question for both of them. They got any advice for new asset store publishers? They recently developed their first tool, and they were wondering if you got any marketing tips or if it's a reliable business at all. I mean, I think you both proven it's a reliable business if you do it right, but do you have any tips for somebody starting out doing tool stuff?
Sure. I put the link in the chat to this person's asset, so if you want to bring it up, you can check it out. I think the first thing is, it takes time. Most assets don't blow up right away. It can. There are some assets that release, and I remember Odin years ago when it first released was like, woo, popular, right? Something like that. But most assets take time. I think some general things after looking at this is always make sure you use the new release discount. I don't know if this was on new release discount or not, but the guidance from the asset store is that it always makes more money, or generally it makes more money for people. So use that because more money, but the asset has to be priced $15 or higher. This asset in particular is, to me, it strikes me as a asset for people who know what they're doing, which does cut out a lot of your market share because there's a lot of people using Unity who are just starting out who might not know what URP is, and
or FSR.
Certainly what FSR is. Now, later in the description, it does state what FXR is. It's the AMD Fidelity FX Super Resolution 1.0. So one tip, put that in the title, like, URP FSR 1.0 presets, and then add into the end AMD, the long version.
Super resolution is what you want. That's the part that people are that don't know what all these terms mean are gonna see and understand that.
Yeah, but also if you search for AMD, I don't know if this asset comes up necessarily. Oh, it does. Okay. So it does. There's 2 that come up on for this thing. One is FSR 2, the other is FSR 1.0, but the other one has 4 stars. So there's that. Who knows? But so there's always keep in mind that if your asset is for people who are further down the pipeline of their game development, or for more experienced developers, you're kind of out of your market share. Not a bad thing necessarily. Just keep that in mind. Also, for something like AMD, I'm assuming it requires an AMD GPU, which also limits the potential user base as well. Just something to keep in mind. Then you get down to the description and all that. You've got a very detailed description, which is good. But again, it is for advanced users. So you might want to, I don't have a direct advice for this, but figure out for your target audience, if you do want to bring in users who maybe are curious about this, but not quite up on what exactly it is, try to add some language to that effect. Again, I don't have specific things there. Random things on the formatting of the description. You could add you can add emojis, which are always nice. You can add lines with dashes. You've got, after this 1, 2, 3, 4 list, there's 2 paragraphs without a space between them. So maybe look into that. Just simple stuff like that. Technical details. Your technical details are very technical. Again, it's for a lot of newer users, too much technical details can seem very scary. But again, if your audience if you're not targeting newer users, then keep this in by all means and target those who know what they're doing. And if that's where you want to go with that. The last thing I would say before pausing is the create with AI. It sounds like you're only using AI for code. You don't need to put the disclaimer up for code anymore. So you can remove that so that users who are scared of AI don't get scared of your tool. And then maybe a video. I see Jason's clicking through those frame FPS, and that's great, but show a video. If you can show a video that shows the difference, turn it off, turn it on, boom, demonstrate that with a very quick, to the point video.
I'm in danger of. Oh no, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, just one thing I want to mention is FSR does also work on NVIDIA GPUs. It's just NVIDIA also has DLSS, which is their equivalent. Might arguably work better, but for maximum marketability, it could work on both forms of GPU.
Okay, there you go.
This is normally the point of the stream where I say something and someone in the comments goes that I sound cocky or obnoxious or something. And so basically my point here is to say that this is such a common problem with like game dev in general. This is more than just this one example, but the technical people solve technical problems and think technically. And then when they explain things to people, they explain it in terms of information, not in terms of value. And so we can go into the long form conversation about marketing and this gets into game stuff as well. But it all boils down to the same thing, which is in the same way that nobody plays your code, they plays your game. Nobody cares about the technical aspects of anything. They care about what it does for them. If you were to go buy something and someone lists off statistics and then they don't tell you what those statistics do for you, they've said nothing of value to you whatsoever. And so that's not to say it isn't valuable and people who know what it is, whatever. But the point is, the headline is performance, and easy. Those 2 words should be floating magically, visibly on screen in big, bold letters. Easy performance. Then you can go into detail about why it's easy performance and what that does for you and the caveats about when and where it doesn't work. But the sales pitch is like, why do I care? Because no one is searching for 2 acronyms. They're searching for my game, performance, help, better, don't know.
FPS boost.
Yeah, right. So you just in general, this goes across the board. The statement is, what is this doing for me? Then in brackets, how it does it and why. So, but literally having some sort of broadcast of what it is, followed by some visual example of this to this effort you have to do, minimal, thumbs up, right? It applies to everything.
And just to point out how this works in a more concrete way, you often look for things based on what they do, not based on what they are. Describe it by what it does, not by what it is. When you are hungry, you look for a cook to make you a meal. You don't look for something that hits an element until it is consumable in a more enjoyable experience.
I've been looking at menus
So,
wrong
yeah.
this whole time.
I wanted to bring that in because I was just saying there that it might be a fun thing to dovetail to, because in parallel to this, there are people who aren't following Thomas Brush's stuff. He's streaming again recently, and the I don't want to say hook or gimmick, but it is legitimately a good one. The content of his latest streams are like a lot of people do, where he reviews existing games. He'll look at the store page and then play them. But the unique aspect that's different than other people is he's not doing it to say, quote unquote, is it fun or is it a game, or whatever, all these kind of more vague metrics. His number one strength is he's a marketer. He's really good at the art, the audio, but more than anything else, he knows how to get people's attention. Like, that's demonstrable across all of the stuff he does. And so he's very good at pointing out the, like, here's the small thing you could do to 10x the level of engagement you'll get from whatever it is you're creating. And so he's done a couple of streams where he'll look at someone's game and just out the gate go, your music's wrong. Your music's completely incongruous with the stuff you're doing, or your editing is too slow, or you need these kind of very quick cuts. You can go into the details of how and why and whatever. But if you want to see a bunch of genuinely good-looking games which have potential to do well, but are still going to wither on the vine because they're screwing up something pretty foundational because their value proposition is not demonstrated in the first 10 seconds of their video, or the pacing of the trailer is so slow that people would have turned off before the first 30 seconds and before they've gotten to the bit that sells it, or something as simple as the game looks good, but the color palette is not cohesive because they haven't picked a simple, a weighting on their colors to the point where, like, it just looks generic. But had they just put a single a wash of the same three colors across everything, it would make the whole thing. There's like these very simple things you can do which will like vastly improve the marketability on something. And so I would say don't dismiss that. Marketability is a huge deal. And I would say check out his streams because he's very good at pointing that stuff out. And you'll be amazed at how like a very small tweak can vastly improve the marketability on something.
Yeah, they've been really good lately. Go ahead.
Yeah, and to just add to that point, Thomas Bosch takes it like every step of the way to show you how much value you can gain by doing it. Like, he literally takes people's capsule art on the Steam store page and he edits it in Photoshop to show you how much value you can get by just doing small changes. He's doing it within like 5 minutes on his end. Imagine what you can do if you invest an entire day in that. And he's going through every step of the logical thinking of it. Even if it's just like booting up the game first time, and one of the first things he does is literally move the cursor over the buttons and see if there is a response. He wants to show you where you can add value to your main menu, because that has like, this is the first experience somebody has. If it's not satisfying, they're going to just quit faster. So yeah, great value out of the streams lately.
I totally agree. Especially, I like watching other people's games too. It's like you get a variety of different stuff in there and interesting feedback.
And to just add on that, he's also working on his own game, and he has streams for that as well. And he's showing you how he's actually using Unity to develop his game, and he's showing literally every step he does to save himself time and focus on the important things. And he explains how he does it. Yeah. Useful.
No, it's definitely great. I would go check it out if you haven't already. But speaking of marketing, I know Andrew's got to go in just a second and has some deals that are over here. You want to tell everybody what's still on sale for Black Friday?
Yeah, so the Black Friday sale is probably another week or so for the asset store, and Infinity VR, Magic Leap Games, has 3 things in the sale. There's the RPG Character Complete 13 character pack for high fidelity characters. So if you're looking to make any sort of fantasy game with high fidelity stuff, that's the one to get. It's 50% off. And then the 2 low poly monster packs are 50% off. So if you're making more Cinti style stuff, these are aimed at matching the Cinti Studio style. They use the Cinti Studios in the video demos with permission from the folks at
their background environments, right?
Background environment, yeah. So they're aimed at fleshing out those games. So if you're using Cinti Studio stuff, then check those out, and those are all 50% off as well.
Nice. I just linked them in the chat, so yeah, go check them out. And then on that topic, I forgot when I did Black Friday sale, I didn't do the old stuff like everybody had requested. I looked at the poll this morning and saw that like 60% of people said just put the old stuff on sale, not the new multiplayer stuff. So I did it today. I cut the price down half off and then marked it half off again for for the weekend for Cyber Monday or Cyber Friday, whatever it is. So there, I'll send out an email about that. But I was looking at the info for when I asked like what people wanted for Black Friday, and apparently after I looked at it last time, the results completely swapped. Like before, it was like, yeah, multiplayer stuff, and then I look again, and it was like 60%. So like just a big discount on the old stuff. So okay, and old is earlier this year. it's the beginner stuff from earlier this year, beginner to intermediate.
I'm gonna hop off like Greg before me. I have to go back to the boring old day job and take a meeting. So,
all right,
see you all later.
Let's have
Good seeing you.
Have a fantastic time.
So, Dave mentioned something, by the way, on that UI toolkit. Do you guys think this is going to matter at all? The UI toolkit functionality not going to go into 2022, but just into Unity 6, which of course is on the new licensing plan and all that. Do you think that's going to matter at all?
No. And I have a very clear answer as to why.
Okay.
Worldspace UI toolkit still lacks features that you'll want to have out of UI in Worldspace. The shaders part that I mentioned earlier is crucial for a good experience in Worldspace UI, especially in VR where you want things to have depth. So it doesn't have the full value even if it's in Worldspace. And because of that, it's not important enough to make it into the last version of 2023.
Makes sense. Yeah, it looks like it's not going to be there according to Dave too. And then, hey Corvallis, nice to see you here. Staying smart, helpful as usual.
Hey Jim, and thank you.
Oh, and I had to pull up this one too. Do you agree with you being cocky and obnoxious? I don't think you're cocky and obnoxious. I think you're awesome. But you can be cocky and obnoxious if you want to. So.
It's your flavor of awesome.
Yeah, everyone's got their their spiky edges. My one thing, actually, because you're here, Cavallo, so I thought I'd mention it. I was talking before how a few people pointed out I've been sort of perusing Twitch recently, just sort of looking at game devs and sort of seeing how people work. Because again, it's genuinely really fascinating, and there's a lot to learn by just watching someone work without, just how they actually work on their game and have been for a year. It tells you a lot about what's not well telegraphed or understood, or stuff that, or standards that I didn't know about, or things that like I've learned a few things watching various streams as well. But one thing that did catch my eye, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. A few people I've noticed were trying to connect web services and API stuff to Unity. And in my humble opinion, they're doing it the wrong way. So I was curious from like what your perspective is regarding things like asynchronous code, calling web services, and how you go about doing that, and how you find it. Because it's one of those things where it didn't really click for me until I watched a bunch of people do it. But a lot of people either come from web backgrounds. If they come from web into Unity, they don't know like what function calls to use or how to use them. Or even worse, I guess, is if you come from a Unity first background where you're learning Unity as your main thing, you have no familiarity with REST APIs and CORS problems and all the other fun issues that come with that. And so you might have real struggle connecting to APIs. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are regarding the general, like that intersection between Unity and the web stuff.
It's fascinating because I definitely was the second camp. So I started with Unity as my real main method of learning. Most of my object-oriented and programming learning was from Unity. So when I started applying web services through some of my AI stuff, a lot of that was me bridging the gap of figuring out what CRUD operations were, working in an environment where you're not dealing with mono behaviors and normal game engine runtimes, but rather pure web development. And the more I've done web development, it's helped flesh out that opinion more. It can be a pain point, and I definitely have some issues with how Unity sets up its web requests, where for instance, like some of the JSON parsing can be very, very script heavy compared to when you can just do it in ASP.NET Core. It's so much easier. It was a big reason why I developed out my tool to just work in ASP.NET Core, because I wanted to automate a lot of the HTTP call functionality and JSON parsing. So all that's just handled in a separate tool, bridged back into Unity, which I ended up recreating the HTTP requests anyway, because having that API and structuring it through Unity's web request is still simpler than some of the other solutions because I got very particular with like web socketing and trying
Yeah,
to do
see,
operations via that.
mhm. This is exactly what I was getting at because I watched a few people do this, and almost everybody was like, I give up. I'm going to just go make my own thing that runs with a command terminal, and I'll connect to that with Unity. And
Mhm.
like literally, I saw multiple people take that approach where they're like, "Oh, I want to connect to the Discord API." So rather than connect to it in Unity, they built a Discord API thing and they connect to that instead.
Yep. And you're
And
gonna run right back into your issues because
yeah,
the
yeah.
moment it's funny because it's a scaling issue. You don't appreciate the full power of like an HTTP request until you need that full power, and you're going to need it. You're just going to build yourself out to it. And once you figure out how to create a nice, systematic, reusable way, you remove a lot of the pain points.
Well, this is where this is what frustrates me because
Mhm.
I do tons of web stuff with Unity. I've got connected to 11 Labs. I've connected to ChatGPT. There's literally there's an API called packofcards.com where you can have it'll actually store and synchronize decks of cards, stacks and picking the most. You can like make asynchronous card games without having to do any of it yourself. Get the art and images of the local. There's tons of cool APIs I've just grabbed for like example purposes. The Pokemon API, which has every bit of information from the entire games. I've used that for research stuff. The general takeaway is when I do web stuff in Unity, it's like 4 lines of code. So I look at all this stuff and I watch people build this entire sea of things, and I'm like, literally what I do is I go to the REST API for the platform, I look at the GET request, I copy the JSON response they say, I go to a website called JSON to C#.com, I paste it in, I press a button, I get a model out, I just copy that into my code, I create a HTTP client, I call await HTTP client.get model, type in endpoint, I get back the data, and I show it in the editor. And then if I want to get really fancy, I add a context menu icon so I can right click in the editor. I don't have to run Unity, and I can pre-populate the arrays in the sidebar while I'm editing without having to press play. And so I look at this and I go back to that thing of I see so many people, and I don't blame people for it. I think it's Unity's description is okay. So here's what you want to do. You want to get this HTTP client request thing and await it, and then do a cover to do all this, and it's all of this nonsense. It is completely unnecessary. When if you just know the HTTP client class and the await keyword, you can get all of this stuff. Again, you have to understand asynchronous and REST APIs and whatever, but the actual amount of work you need to do, I've wrapped all of that with JSON.NET, with my own custom response object. So when there's a brand new API I want to use, I go to the API, I copy just the base URL, I copy just 2 or 3 endpoints, I do the model bounding, and it takes me about 8 minutes to take an entire REST API and make an ingest function that lets me distribute all the models, display them, and call the post functions in my code. And again, this isn't some like super big brain thing. This is just the way it's normally done in web stuff. It's just not translated if you've not done .NET, whatever. And it's just one of those things that fascinates me because I see a lot of, because it's second class citizen in Unity when as more and more of this web stuff is coming about with APIs and AI and whatever, it just fascinates. Like it should really be more known that it's like you don't need to reinvent the wheel when literally all you're doing is ingesting a REST API,
Yep. This is I have a similar reaction for when there were a lot of the earlier AI tools that were released. It's literally just about 4 lines of systematic code. And a lot of people also are not aware of web security when they start doing API or web related things. The amount of tools where people were putting their API key in the
Keys,
tool and publicly releasing it was very upsetting because I was at least and I admit I knew a lot of my like web knowledge really started January of this year because that was when I got some of my first web contracts and I started doing it more regularly. So it was around that time that I realized, oh yeah, like API key, I should probably not put that in my code. How do I sanitize that? That's probably not something I want just in my Visual Studio. And then I saw a lot of people who didn't know that. And then it reinforced, okay, I should learn some very basic data sanitization principles. It's coming from a Unity background where you're not aware of like what await does. You don't really like using coroutines, but sometimes you put up with them. And admittedly, this is a pain point for the web request too, is sometimes it will throw, I believe, a data leak error if you don't close the download handler even when you take in content, because I was trying to follow through like a random memory trace error I kept getting, and it's very specifically with the download handler if you do not close it after usage. It's never explained anywhere or explicitly mentioned you have to, but it will sometimes occasionally cause a memory leak error. So now my error log is getting compiled with memory leak errors, but it didn't give me a clear enough stack trace to find where it was. So there's a friction of learning it and probably learning REST and all the basics of web development initially, on top of learning Unity's flavor of web development. It makes people think, okay, I'll just learn the web on its own. And then when you realize you have to connect to that web on its own, you then can now learn the Unity part. And now you've come full circle. Congratulations, you're writing web requests again.
And not to mention, this is one of those things. This has even tripped me up, and it drove me insane. I lost like 4 days of my life, and I'll never. So angry. When you send requests to certain APIs and things, there's headers. Effectively, you can basically have headers that say what I can accept, what I ask for. And now some of the obvious ones are yes. Sometimes the API key is in the header and blah blah blah. But some APIs want to gate the content calls not by your account, but just by user agent. They want to basically make sure it's not a bot. And so there's sort of it's kind of a standard, I guess, but there's a certain header you can add called user agent. And it's basically, who are you? Are you Chrome? Are you Firefox? Are you Unity? Where are you coming from? And some APIs will just outright not reply to you if you didn't just name yourself when you make a call. And very few, not many of them do, but occasionally this will trip you up. And there's a bunch of things like this with Unity where the default headers are not there for stuff. So I spent ages once where an API worked perfectly in Postman. It worked in my command line code. It worked everywhere. But when I ran it in Unity, I was getting random errors. And there was not enough information in the error to tell me what it was. I literally just had to write add header, user agent, anything. Literally any letters, as long as there was some descriptive name. And yeah, that caught me off guard a couple of times.
Yeah, I've had that myself. That and getting back the wrong type because I didn't realize that it was going to default to XML instead of JSON. Some of the older APIs, especially, and have to specify that in the request header.
Yeah, it's all those pain points in practice that lead to very interesting development paths. You can get there. And once you've gotten there, you can appreciate web requests for its faults and its pros and use it more effectively. But a lot of people are going to initially say, I want AI in my game, and try to implement it, probably do a very weird implementation of it, build out their own thing, come back, and also realize that because Unity's new web services exist, you could also use Cloud Code and just kind of obfuscate your operations as well. So there's a lot of options. And you're probably going to strangle yourself with your options before you finally figure out what actually works for you.
This is actually one of those parts that I wanted to bring up really early on into the conversation, because a lot of people reinvent the wheel specifically because the wheels that exist look too intricate. This is why people reinvent physics. This is why people reinvent systems that already exist, such as the light making, etc., etc. There are so many things that you see people reinvent the wheel when there's like a single method that does everything they ever wanted available on the sidelines, either poorly documented, not documented, or not talked about, even if it's documented and poorly, like fully implemented. And one of the things that is really hard on async development, specifically with web requests, is that you are stacking up a lot of intricate things. You have to know how to connect to another computer. You have to know how to wait for stuff. A lot of people that start from game development are used to immediate loops. What begins in the update ends in the update. Net development is not like that, because you're sending things and they're going to come eventually, if at all. And you have to write code that accommodates that without stopping everything. And that's something that doesn't come into and that does not come intuitively to Unity users, because they don't almost ever have to deal with that.
I guess the reason I want to flag it up though is because it is kind of like an infinite sea of potential power, because it's literally down to whatever you connect to, whatever it does. For example, I have a test project which has APIs that connect to my local Eagle instance, to my local Search Everything server, to my Discord to my Gmail to my TV database to my scrobbling on music brains, and like basically I can take any piece of data from, like, I can search my own file system in seconds, take the data, generate folders, connect to TV. So I can do all of this in Unity. I can grab sprites and images. I can render those images in the UI. And you can ask ChatGPT to rename and structure stuff. You can do all of this stuff. And the reason I bring this up is you'll find a lot of services, like you can find asset packs on or assets on the store that'll be like ChatGPT integration for the editor. But while I understand it's complicated new information, it is 4 lines of code. Legitimately, the entire like predominant weight of features of ChatGPT in the Unity editor is about 4 lines. Obviously, there's more information if you learn what you're doing, blah, blah, blah. But my point is just to say that, like, one, don't be too scared of it. It is there, it's available. But the other one is be wary of people selling you wrappers on APIs when legitimately the work you could do to do that is actually quite small if you take the time to learn it.
Yeah, and oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, shit.
You first.
Sure. Alphabetical order. It's just because if you
Oh, that's terrible for your eye. Sorry, but alphabetical.
It's to add on top of that too, the effort it would take for you to actually build out that functionality and not just use the wrapper, you're able to access way more power than just what the wrapper is able to do. The wrapper fundamentally like limits your playpen, working with the infrastructure and with the framework it built out. And what I've learned through a lot of just my private experimentation is I like the less wrapping there is because you can get way better functionality out of it. And especially for like AI in games, if you really want to use it more than just I'm chatting to a ChatGPT bot, a lot of that has to be bespoke, and it's a trade-off.
Yeah, and to actually add on that, because it's a very wise thing to say, if I may add, when you don't use somebody else's wheel with all its intricacies, you can build your own and you can get so much more power because you know exactly how this wheel works and you can use its full power. When you use a lot of stuff that are provided by Unity or by literally anything else, they may start things and then throw them out as soon as they're done with your specific request. So you're losing out a lot of power or calculations that you may want to reuse for other things. If you're building the entire process yourself, you can get everything you need at once. And this is like one of those big things that you get out of reinventing the wheel that I will advocate for if you really, really need it. There are, for example, Unity's animation system. A lot of people don't deal with it well, so they build their own, and then they're happy because they have all the functionality they wanted. They lost the functionality Unity added, but they got the things that they need. So that's that. On the prior topic, a lot of the things that people take for granted are actually more complicated than they see. For example, with every net request, you have get a file and request it however you need it, then understand what that file is, turn it into something you can use, and then finally use it. That's like the fundamentals. Make a web request, get the object, translate it into whatever object that you need, and then use the object as you see fit. But there are a lot of ways to achieve that. For example, when you call file.open, you're basically saying, give me a file handle, read all the contents, give it to me, and then I'll load it up as whatever object I need, and then I'll use it. And then when you're translating it, you're using a translation service, sometimes like it's JSON, so it's building out the entire object for you, and it may do something wrong there as well, etc. You have to know that all of those services stack up, but you're doing the exact same thing every time. Even if you're just dragging and dropping a field in Unity, for example, an object reference, it does all of that as well. Saying rigid body dot mass equals 10, it's doing all of that behind the scenes. It's easier to look at. And if you know what's going on behind everything, you can actually start messing with the process to gain advantages or functionality that you didn't have before.
In my case, caching is a big one, right? Like I made an API call which would so for one of my example projects is I took that Pokemon API I let you search for Pokemon. I would then grab the Pokedex entries from the list of that Pokemon. I would then send it to ChatGPT and ask it to rewrite it like a pirate. And then I would send that to 11 Labs and then have it read it with someone's voice. I think I used David Tennant at the time. But it's using my units to generate the voice stuff, and so I don't want to do it every time. And so when I got back the audio file, I would save it in the app data folder cached with the file name changed to a hash of the text of the input text. So if I happen to request the exact same input text the second time, I would just pull the exact same matching file that I had before, with the additional caveat that Unity doesn't out of the box support MP3 for various different licensing reasons. And so I was using another API in the process that would cache it as a wave. So that way I would have automatic support when I pull it back in for different stuff. Again, this is obviously more layers of complexity than we were originally talking, but the point still stands, is the end result of the code I had was speak Pokedex entry, and it would do either go API, generate, come back, build stuff, whatever, or it would be, oh, you've done this at least once in the past. Here's the audio file. No extra cost, no web services, no whatever.
Yeah. And it's literally just following, get the file, use it however you need it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, next topic.
I did see one question in the chat I did want to point out. That was, are there any good places to start learning API implementations for Unity? Because that's a great, like, actionable question. As for great places, I can kind of speak to my experience when I was first learning them. For API implementations, Taro Dev's web dev stuff was a great starter for me. It was super informative. He gives you direct examples, and it also does inform some of my opinion even to this day. I have a begrudging relationship with web requests. It's functional, but man, does ASP.NET Core make that so much easier. It's just so much nicer. But that and actively building out projects that are tiny AI related stuff. So, and of course, the hot new thing when it comes to tapping that via web. But as Jason mentioned, there's several other services like card games. Build out small things that let you just tap an API, get used to it. And also using other tools like Postman, which is a great way for you to set up, how do I actually engage with this API? And then let me translate that logic to my C# engine rather than trying to troubleshoot that in real time. And you should be unit testing all of this. Because why would you hit play mode every time you want to test this API? My lord, don't do this to yourself.
Yeah, writing little tests makes it super easy to call these APIs from the editor. Oh shit, I just had a question for Story and I lost it. What was it, Jason? What was I gonna ask you? Oh.
To add on that, Hugo CodeMonkey, he has a few videos where he uses APIs to implement systems in his games, like the Dark Souls messages that you see on the floor in Dark Souls and the other games of the brand. And there is also always the Unity documentation. But beyond that, if you're trying to talk about using any web API, it's literally just a matter of constructing a request, getting whatever the request says that you're going to get, and then trying to use it as you were told to. So there really isn't much. It's like we really are overcomplicating. Write a single request. Once you've done that, there is no longer an API to work with. This is literally all the request.
The real difficulty is understanding web standards, like understanding what the term REST means and what what response codes are and which response codes mean which particular things. On a small note, actually, because you brought it up, I don't know if anybody else. This is more of a web person to web person. I'm really hating Postman right now. In the last 4 years, they've become a bloated mess of crap with extra features I don't want and horrible stuff they keep trying to push you towards. I've completely replaced it now. There's something called Thunder Client. It's a plugin for VS Code. So now it's literally just a tab in VS Code that has the bare bones features I want from Postman, which is just a tab where I can generate a GET or POST request. Infinitely better. And I'm really happy I switched.
Yeah, Postman's definitely grown.
It does a lot more than I needed to. Yeah.
One thing that I do want to point out in regards to web requests in Unity, almost every Unity web request object, like as you make the request, you get an object handle back. It has fields for error, etc., etc. So you literally don't even have to interact with the response codes. Unity already does 99% of that for you.
And also, if you are using something like HTTP client, there's something called ensure success code, which is a single line you can do, which says everything that doesn't count as a thumbs up is considered an error, which may sound like a scary overcomplicate, but it does mean you can blanket grab the whole lot and say, this didn't come back in a way I can reliably work with. If you know more, you can go in and like tweak stuff, but as a fundamental level, that's a really nice way to just say, don't break on me. Don't give me like an incorrect JSON format that I can't parse or whatever.
And speaking of that, Jason, you said you use a converter, right? Yeah, I used to use the one built into Visual Studio till they removed it. Is there a specific one that you found is better than the others, or you just use the first thing that pops up on Google?
You mean for JSON to C#?
Yeah.
Legitimately, I use the website JSON2C#.com. Admittedly,
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't. I should literally, it's such a simple task that I could literally write my own command. Like, for example, I have ChatGPT in my command line. Like, I don't go to the website anymore. I just open a terminal and type GPT space and ask a question. I could probably do the same thing with this, which I just haven't gotten around to yet. But again, the website has just been so clean, served me well. And normally I can sit there. I have the website open already because I'm reading the documentation for the client. So opening a second tab, copying the model and pasting it in while I'm reading the JSON response model, it's usually so quick that I don't need a second tool for it.
Yeah. And by the way, a lot of APIs, no, not a lot, but a good chunk of APIs even give you those model source code files for different languages, which is always nice when they do that. I mean, they're just auto-generating them. Of course, we used to do that for a lot of APIs I built, and just make the models right there available automatically. And there's some tools that would do that too, make it even easier. But
one more thing I'd like to add here is that it kind of almost goes without saying for all of us, but don't repeat yourself when you're working with web APIs. Make a single point in your code that handles the request, and then from there, just call that code. It's going to make everything so much easier in case you need to change the request, or in case you need to repeat like long parts of it, like constructing the header, or etc., etc. Just make a request.
Oh, that's a good point.
Almost.
This is so frustrating for people who, again, I totally see why it's easy to fall into this trap. So I used to write APIs. That was a previous job I had for years. So the way data is returned is annoyingly not standard. There literally are standards, but nobody uses the standards, or they correctly interpret them their own way in like 50 different ways. Something as simple as pagination. Did they use the X API page headers, or did they return a response model with a count and page counts? If they did return the page counts, did they return the fully qualified URL to the next page, or did they not return it changes every single time, which gets a bit frustrating. All of this is to say, if you use something like JSON to C# and you do it on an endpoint that says get all blank, and then you do it on get one blank, you might get back a completely different looking model, but they might actually be the same model as returned by the API, but different fields were returned. So this is getting a bit niche, but it's just something to point out. If you were using something like JSON to C# and you're copying and pasting these models, you might notice after a while a lot of them look suspiciously similar. And that's because they're literally the same response model, but it's leaving out fields that are not being returned. You can compound that by putting all the fields into one and then creating a result object. You can I see that a lot, where it's like a lot of redundant data, where realistically the entire API is returning 3 objects, but the objects keep coming back slightly differently because of the call they make. And so people keep making each model for each unique slight variant. So again, another reason why it's useful to kind of understand the response models and read the API documentation. Otherwise, you might find yourself wasting a lot of time.
Yeah, apparently we've been wasting more time because I didn't realize it was just built into Writer too. Paul just shared this.
Yeah, it's built in.
I guess it makes sense. It makes sense. It would have been. I just never checked.
Just need to find it. Yeah, need to figure out where that option is exactly. It probably just hit shift twice and find it.
Yeah, shift twice and write pasta special JSON as classes. Yeah, if you start, if you have, you copy the JSON into clipboard, and then if you start writing with double shift pasta special, it will just give you the answer and it will generate the code.
Yeah.
Bless Ryder for being such a good idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is good stuff. So just pop it onto your clipboard, double tap shift, and type JSON and hit enter, and it'll just go right in there as a class. You don't have to do
Again,
anything else.
Little asterisks on that too, to be other website I recommended, the default for most of these defaults to property syntax, which is fine, but it means if you try to display that model as a public model in the editor, it won't show the fields unless you're using the field serialized field attribute, which is overkill in my opinion because they're just plain DTOs. So what you should do is switch to just public field syntax and display just the values. So yeah, if you're doing it this way, even the responses I'm seeing here are coming back as properties. So make sure to modify them so they come back the way you want.
On the topic of APIs, and it's not exactly the exact same context, but in the Unity changelog for 2023.2, they actually added something really awesome and really stupid at the exact same time, and I just wanted to bring it up. They keep using the word API when they're just really adding methods to Unity. So they said they added a canvasRender.getMesh API, and it's literally just canvasRender.getMesh as a method. Something really useful because you can like get the mesh that's rendering your canvas and then do modifications for it. Or for example, if you have a single canvas that you want to reuse in multiple places, you can literally get the mesh and start rendering it instanced multiple times. Or you can start doing things like adding vertices to it, tessellation for the canvas render. It's something pretty advanced. You don't really need that. Nobody really needs it. And they also had a set mesh API. So there's a lot of potential there. Just not, I don't think it's appropriate to call it an API.
Actually, that's one thing. I just want to put an asterisk there too, because this also drives me insane. API versus SDK. Does anybody know the literal, like, what is the differences and why they're used and how you should kind of refer to them?
Now you're making everybody nervous because it's almost like a trick question. A programming interface versus... Go on.
Yeah, I'll just start with a no, please.
So it's one of those things where it's intuitive, but it's not. So the idea is you have an application. It's, Jason's Cookie Factory makes cookies, and if you want to use that, you can either use it by using the UI, and it might be like a physical hand crank and a bunch of buttons to make cookies, or there might be a web app, which is a GUI or graphical user interface to interact with it. But maybe you want to program it yourself. You've got your own timer magic clock and you want to make the cookies happen on a clock timer. You would like to program this application. So you would use an application programming interface. You would use a means with which you can interact with a system, an existing application, using an external tool. That's awesome. That's what an API is. And oftentimes these days you use a REST API, which is basically a resource version of that, which has standard models for ins and outs and whatever. But if you would like to build an application which uses this other application in your application, you would like to develop using my software. So you would need a kit that would tell you how to use my software in your application. So you would use a software development kit, which a software development kit is something you would plug into your application as a set of tools to help you interface with the rest of the stuff that I'm doing. So long story short, the general pipeline is there is stuff, which is an application, which exposes an API, an SDK consumes the API, makes it friendly to be used and integrated in an application, and traditionally your application will use the SDK. You can use the API directly if you know the different endpoints to it. But the general point is traditionally, if you go to a website and go, oh, I want to use your service, they'll provide you the API to do calls, but they'll often have a tab where it's like, or here is our Python SDK, which is like, we've done all of that for you. You just have to drop it in and interface with it. So yeah, there's the two kind of layers of it.
Okay. The layman's, as close as you can get to layman describing this, is the API is the direct endpoints, methods exposed. The SDK is a nice wrapper for consumption, for integration in other applications.
Yeah.
Although it doesn't necessarily have to be to an external API, of course.
No, it doesn't have to. But the point I like to go with is that people forget an API isn't data. People think of it as like, oh, I'm just getting data from the internet. It's not. It is an application. There's a floating magical application somewhere, and an API lets you effectively press virtual buttons. That's the way I like to think of it. Is you're sending it input box typing and you're getting back virtual responses. And if you think about it that way, it becomes a lot more like a magical web application. And then the SDK is, in order to know what magical spells to call to do stuff is a lot of work. The SDK does that for you. It's like, as someone who wrote the API, we know what you need to do to get back the results that you actually want. So the SDK is just that friendly layer on top of it, which does the extra stuff, you know.
Okay, and not everyone provides an SDK. Sometimes you may just need to do that work in your application.
And sometimes you'll find free ones as well. Yeah, it would still be an SDK. And in fact, you'll often find free SDKs people have made conceptually on GitHub for other people's stuff, where they'll consume someone else's API. Again, it doesn't have to be an API. Software development kit can be like for local files. Like, for example, I could make an SDK that integrates with, like, you know, my own file system for doing stuff if I wanted to do particular things. It doesn't have to be, but in this day and age, almost everything is easier with that sort of pipeline, because if you expose it as a REST API, you can then do auto generations on it. In fact, that's another thing that's a whole extra layer on top of this. There's something called Open API specification. And that basically means if you write your API a certain way, you can do it. A Swagger doc is the old name, but Open API spec is the new name.
I was going to ask, is that still the thing?
It's still the thing. It's become more posh now. It's no longer Swagger docs. It's now like the Open API spec version.
The old name was better.
It's got to have a professional
name.
Yeah, it was Swagger, and what was the tool name that generated them?
Swashbuckle was the tool.
It's like nice piratey names.
Exactly. Yeah. So what that does, basically, the point is, if you have a specification that says, I expose these things, I have made whatever my cookie API, and there's something called get cookie, get all cookies, get person, get cookies for person, get types of cookie, get ingredient list. And these are like common endpoints of data structures. You can just outline, these are the entities or resources in my system, and here's how to access them. And then you can generate a website which gives you an interactable API. But the cool part is there's also generators which will take that doc and generate a full SDK. It'll literally expose the models, generate the code, create the code in your language of choice, and then drop in a set of scripts which will then do all of the plumbing work for you. So that's another part of that layer, is that if you do have standardized APIs, you can generate the SDK entirely. I never do that. I prefer to write it myself because there's utility functions that make it nicer for people and whatever, but it's just good to know that's a possibility.
Awesome. I did not know that you could auto-generate SDKs off of I'm just going to call it Swagger API.
Yeah.
You just have ChatGPT do it now.
Also true. Have ChatGPT write the whole thing.
Yeah. I need an API and an SDK, please. Create them.
But if you do find yourself writing an API, again, this is more of just a personal rant to all the people who've wasted years of my life doing this. If you ever find yourself writing an API, please, for the love of God, Google the actual HTTP response codes and use them correctly, because it may seem like a passive thing to you, but it is the core information utility for people using your endpoints.
Do you want to send the success with an error message?
They're not the ones that kill me. It's the 500s versus 400s. They're the ones that get you.
Actually, yes.
500 means your fault. 400 means my fault. Make sure you give me that information so I know if I have to correct my recalls or your server broke. I need to know that information.
Yes.
On that point, two things that we keep on saying but are important. First, exceptions are exceptional. Don't start using exceptions if it's not something that is in your control. Just return a result that is like disappointing but not an error. And secondly, all of this stuff relates to giving the user of whatever you're making a good experience. It doesn't matter if you're using web APIs or just a standard C# library that you're giving anybody to consume offline. Make the experience good. If something is going wrong, report exactly what is happening so somebody has a way to deal with it and understanding at least why things are wrong. You want to give as much as you can to make sure the experience of whoever is consuming whatever you're making is the best it can be. This is all.
Can I pause and ask you all a quick question before I forget it? Because I know I'm going to forget it. It's something that came up earlier this week in one of the calls with students, and I didn't have a good answer for it, and I don't think anybody does, but maybe out of everybody I know, one of you here might have a good way to do this. They had a Unity application that has a bunch of little panels that show different data, and in one of those panels, they want to show the graphical output of another Windows app. Anybody know a good way to do that? That I can't think of one that would work well.
Render texture?
What? You could. There is an actual method.
Yeah, there's a
I think
host.
it's
There's a
related
host
to
thing.
render.
You can actually do a lot of that stuff with. So again, it's a bit hacky, but there's a couple of solutions. One of them is the WinForms API, like the ye old back.net version, actually has a whole load of interop functions that let you do a lot of fun things, where you could literally like embed XNA windows in your app or embed apps in your other apps for like, it's kind of like iframe type stuff. And if you drop that DLL into your project and do some interop stuff, you can do all of that. Same with things like interacting with the windows and the operating system. It's possible. It's a little bit messy, but it's doable. A simpler version, if your app is a web app, which again may not be the case.
It's not. This was not a non-web app. Web apps, I was explaining, not too difficult.
Or something.
It's pretty easy, yeah. But for a non-web app, a Windows app, and I don't know the if it's like C++ native one or WinForms or WPF or what.
The short answer is look for comms interop stuff using the DLL with WinForms. But I would say my real answer is don't do that at all. My real answer is look at the app itself and find out if they have a intermediate file. So what I'll often do is I will find out where the app I'm using saves its data. For example, I can literally find the directory where Eagle and Obsidian on my machine are and read the damn JSON files that they save out. And so rather than trying to do this weird, messy interop stuff, you can just read and write their own files to their own system and use that as an intermediate solution. Again, depends what kind of app you're talking about. But normally when you say you want another app in your app, what you really mean is I want the data in and out of that app. You don't normally literally want that app in your app. And so you can kind of get around that by building your own programming interface to it.
I'm going to send you on a hellish journey, but I know I've seen this in one of the Unity patch notes. I just don't remember the name of this method, and I cannot find it right now. So it exists. It's somewhere there. I think you're getting a handle to a different Windows rendering, and like you can provide that handle, and then it will try to render it within Unity. I don't remember the details.
Okay. Well, if I can, I'll do some searching too, and if I can find that,
I will say. The two that I've found most useful is the VB.NET DLL, as god awful as VB.NET is, has a bunch of really interesting short handles for native stuff in OSs, as does the WinForms DLL. So again, it's a hack, but like for me, I found the easiest is to literally build the desktop app, steal the DLLs from it, and then use those DLLs in Unity, providing you're on the right framework match, and it works. It's just you just have to know how to call into it.
That makes sense. Okay, well, thanks. That's helpful. I'll give him the feedback, and I'm gonna do some research into that method because I want to see if I can find that and try it out.
It's going to haunt me in my dreams now because I can't remember.
One night you'll wake up in a cold sweat and it'll stand over you.
It'll be sent to standing over you, telling you.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's what paralysis demon, the alien they use for census. My lord.
Yeah, but I think the easiest way would be just use user32 DLL from Windows, and if it's on Windows, and just grab the window, render it into Unity. It's the simplest way.
Yeah. There is one question that we skipped really early on by Bruno Gattai regarding how to sync up game logic with animations. I just want to answer it very quickly without diving too deep into it. If you are using Unity's animator component, in the animator controller asset, literally pick any of your animation states, and in the bottom of the inspector, there will be a button called Add Behavior. This is a state machine behavior, and it's literally synced up to your animation. It's the best way to sync up logic to an animation if you're using the animator component. That is all.
Yeah, you did a full talk on that, showing how to use it. It is a...
And that talk is just a primer. I have like 5x the amount of information on that than what I had in that talk.
Pal, what's this one here? set window?
This is very old answer how to do it in Unity. I would have to look up the newer version because I done something similar that the person that wrote here is doing. So he's just grabbing the handle to window and then using rendering it and using it.
Oh, is he rendering it or just moving it in front of the window?
It's moving it, but you can then take it and render it if you know what it's on the screen.
Oh, okay.
And
Sweet.
again, you can do so much of that. Like people do not realize, you can grab window rectangles. There's like Unity games where you actually play on your own desktop windows. You can create that taskbar icons that have the hovers and preview templates. You can basically any of the native windows, like notification APIs and stuff. You can hook into all of that stuff if you use it. It's often pretty janky, and things like capturing mouse, and you can override p invoke handles. It's a whole load of crazy stuff you can do there. It just tends to get a bit frustrating and messy if you go too far down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, there was also an API, I don't know if it's still available, that you could just create a .NET application and get window Unity game as the renderer inside the just WPF application forms, and then you could just use whatever .NET API you need.
If you haven't seen,
thing.
just one last thing on that. There's a game called Outcore that came out recently enough, and it's getting huge praise. It's Unity based, and it literally lives on your desktop.
I saw this, yeah.
It opens Paint and uses MS like on your machine as part of the gameplay, and like has you navigate your file system and stuff. It does some interesting interop connection stuff. It's
the
worth.
one?
Yeah, it's very
super
like
cute.
It's got some very interesting ideas. Yeah, I literally downloaded it exclusively so I could try to decompile and have a look at the fun toys they're playing with, because they're doing a lot of fun stuff.
One more thing I wanted to add. Everything we've said about like user 32 DLL, etc., you can literally use that on Unity's editor itself to some very extreme use cases. Specifically, I recently had to do that with. I was trying out multiplayer play mode when it was in a really, really early version, and every time you pressed play, the windows that it adds would undock themselves if they were docked to one of the corners of the screen, and they would flash on the taskbar. And there was no way to undo that within multiplayer play mode. So I had to write code to find the window handles for all the Unity editors, ask them to kindly unflash themselves, and dock to the nearest corner of the screen. And eventually I just started adding like power tools to reorder them this way, reorder them that way, etc., fit them as best as you can within how many are open. A lot of that is really easy to do, but you have to use user32 DLL, and if there is anything that goes wrong, the error codes are a mess.
I will say though, on that note, there's one thing that's like, don't get me started on that stuff. Like one of the most powerful things you can like integrate with your app, obviously not great for distributing for other people, but for local plugins, if anyone's not using, there's something called Search Everything by Void Tools. It's probably one of the most powerful tools I use on my computer. It's
literally used it 5 times while we're on this stream.
yeah, I've used it a couple times while we're talking too. It effectively indexes your OS. It gives you access to any file across your computer instantly. And if you know regular expressions and stuff, you can like literally do quick filters to anything.
Even if you don't, it's super helpful because you just instant find everything.
And it's even on remote drives.
Yeah, but here's the bit that people don't realize, I think is the cool part. It has a service that runs with, you can just interrupt with it. You can ask it questions and get data back. So I have a script in my Unity project, which is literally type search, get list back of a array of strings. So any editor tooling I want, I don't have to do all of that really annoying search, find file, blah, blah, blah. I can just type a filtered keyword into my Unity editor and find the matching file anywhere on my machine, even in other Unity projects, and just auto import and drop it into my existing project. So of all of the integrations I've done a whole lot of stuff, but being able to just say right here in this moment, do a star.cs search for every code file, type in a certain keyword like utilities, find every C# utility file I've ever written across my entire computer, see a list of them, click one of them and say add to project, and it just drops in appropriately into the project. Stuff like that is like, again, it's instant as well, which is crazy cool.
I just dropped the link for that in the chat too. If you guys haven't tried it out yet, it's definitely worth it. I haven't tried the API, but I use it a lot to just find random stuff when I want to.
I brought it up because it does very similar to what we're talking about. You literally have to import their DLL, which is written in C++, and create your own hook object, which uses the attributes to basically interop with it. So it's very relevant to what we're talking about, because you literally have to do the interop pointer stuff, which again, a bit messy, but if you do it, like, it's really powerful.
Nice. Makes sense. So there was a comment here that this was the most informative episode they've ever listened to. Thanks. So I think that's
not pretty technical this time. Yeah,
it's all you guys. But don't forget to hit thumbs up if you liked the episode, and if you have questions, make sure that you're asking them or dropping them in the comments. I think we got a few more minutes. Do you guys have any other topics you want to take, or questions, or things you want to jump into?
Yeah. The question by Rising Force, do you know if the new input system will be easier to understand? Let's say I need to recreate classic games like Golden Axe, Double Tap running. Anybody want to take that?
It will not be easy to understand. It will be more powerful.
Yes.
It has gotten easier to understand, though. Right? You guys agree that over like the last year, it's definitely become quite a bit easier to use?
I'm still waiting for them to add the global input profiles, but it has gotten easier. It's still not as easy as the original. A lot of the new functionality is more bespoke, like you can see it in the visual editor, which is great for people who don't program. That said, it does have disadvantages, specifically in regards to customizing if you don't know how to interface with it, I guess.
I still think they fundamentally made it unnecessarily complicated right at the root. Like, again, it's much better, but better is relative, because and a good example of this is, again, I've been on Twitch recently a bit, and I literally helped someone switch over who's been using Unity for a month, and I was kind of going through the like, okay, I want to explain this because it is pretty messy, and even when we were doing it together, I was getting myself tripped up about the difference between .performed and .triggered. The fact that they have to choose these asinine level of sort of mildly, like, to go from the clarity of pressed, held, and released to having, now again, there's power and reason why, but the fact that you have to go down this rabbit hole of keyboard.current, .a key, was pressed this frame, or was triggered, like all of these, the branching from one to the other is extremely unintuitive, especially once you get to the idea of like all of the event stuff. Again, the TLDR is we settled on the way I tried to show him all like 5 ways to do it. Using player input, not using player input. Using the generated C# version, not using it. Using the player input with the events, using it by using the normal event version. Using it by automatically using it in the editor. Using it by referencing it directly with the keyboard. Like, I went through using just the user input actions. Like, there's so many ways to approach the same thing, but all of them have their own levels of head scratching confusion that we ended up settling on the compiled C# version because it seemed easier to just instantiate your thing and do it. But even that doesn't make sense if you're not familiar with the fact that it's code generation and you have to make sure to save and rebuild and do the thing. And it frustrates me that they don't have a one-to-one parity, that there's not just like literally thing.pressed, things.released, thing.held. Even if the goal is to pivot away, there should be new input, .pressed, .released, and .held. They should have just had out of the box that solution, and it's so infuriating they don't.
Yeah, I think they need that before they can deprecate the old one. They need to just put in a wrapper there that essentially does that, because it's such a waste.
Because even something as simple as you have to call .enable and disable, if you do not know that, that's so new relative to the old way of doing it. And the other thing that catches me off guard, people who are not familiar, who live in the Unity landscape the whole time, have never used constructors in their life for anything because they've been used to it, now have to learn what's effectively a whole new concept to them. Now, granted, it's bargain basement day one C# stuff, but literally Unity has worked so hard to avoid using it that not using it is actively hurting people, because nobody's like, why do I have to write new here, but never anywhere else in anything ever? It's just, again, frustrating. Just small things.
A broader testament, if you work with Unity, please program in other things too. Unity is great. It is a great practice. You will become a better Unity programmer if you step out of that comfort zone and try other like direct C# things. Infinitely helped during my learning. And there were periods where I was now a Unity master. I knew the most esoteric and niche Unity methods. And then I got very, very confused the moment I had to look at async and normal C# .NET behavior. Please, like, branch out earlier, sooner.
Yeah, one thing, I don't want to call anybody out, but I did read an article on Medium and it made me laugh, where it was, what are coroutines? Let's explain coroutines. And the example functions were async void. It's like, you're literally not using coroutines in your example tutorial on how to use coroutines, because you're conflating the task parallel library with coroutines because they just happen to use the same keyword because of that kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah. Just to note on that, the new input system is great. Do try to learn it if you can. It will complicate things. You will lose time that if you'd like to focus on actually creating games, you don't necessarily need it. If you plan to ship games and you want to allow customization of input in those games, it will have some value. If you are using Unity UGUI and you are trying to debug issues using the event system printout when you are debugging it, you will lose that in the new input package because they have not fixed it, even though it's release ready and it's already reaching 1.8.
And don't even get me started on
a little bit of that rage there.
Like their debug window, we've got this entire tree structure. You can look at all the data from the devices and the inputs and the actions and their press. Cool. Can I just see if the button pressed? You have to like drill down these tree structures. They do not expose what you obviously want to see in the editor for debugging. But okay, aside from ranting, because that's just us using it, I do want to make one thing clear to kind of highlight what Jorai was saying. We, even for all our ranting, we don't recommend the UI toolkit. It's the new using for UI. It's not ready to really put in your game. New input system, it is ready to put into your game. It's probably the way I would legitimately go if I was making a game and wanted to have the input system in it. So that's the short answer, is it is actually the thing you should move towards. It's just going to be a pain in the ass to do so.
Yep.
And if you're doing a local multiplayer, it makes it super simple. It's actually really nice for that. It's just kind of pre-built and gives you that functionality with split screen setup and multiple inputs. And
in its own defense, it's also pretty easy to integrate it with the netcode for game objects. Just saying.
And as frustrating as enabling and disabling stuff is, even if you're using it naively, like you're just using the basic functions, the ability to have the turn off or on your UI or turn off or on an object and have all input that goes to that object, like the player, stop, is really nice and saves a lot of headaches later for stuff like your character walking around while you're navigating your UI menus and stuff, which can happen if you're not familiar with how the event. So there is a lot of like, even in like the mild integrations, there's a lot of niceties that gets there. But yeah, things like the fact that in certain cases, if you want the value, you have to set your button to value type to get the value out for doing so. There's just, so many annoyingly, unnecessarily confusing things.
Oh. All right. Well, anybody got any last things you want to talk about before you get going for the week?
If anybody is thinking of using Unity 2023.2, I'd wait until they hotfix it a bit. That is all.
That's right. Yeah, I think. Anybody know when Unity 6 or 2023.3 is coming out?
In 2024.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I would assume my guess was like January, February, but I don't really know what the release schedule is. So I was curious if anybody.
Generally speaking, I'm pretty sure it's on the start of Q2 usually.
Yeah.
We have 2 Unity versions ish a year for the past while, and it's always like after the first half of the year or around it, we get 0.1, and then near the end of the year, as per the past 2 weeks, we get 0.2, and then the year after, slightly in, we get 0.3, which is really just long-term support hotfixes. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll see. see how it goes. A couple last second things. Powell's sale is still going on. Make sure that you check that out. Is there anything in the Flash deal?
No, there was WatchSteamer, but it was 2 weeks ago or something like that.
Oh, okay. Well, there's
Hi,
still all the
Thomas.
50% off stuff. Thomas is here. We were just telling everybody earlier to go check out Thomas's streams. If you haven't subscribed, click his name in the chat and just go subscribe and go check him out. You know, he's been doing awesome live streams like it's been like 2 weeks now, I think. My brain's all out of it from that car crash, so I've lost track of time. But for a week or two, they've been doing these streams and they've been really cool. So definitely check those out. Go grab the Nature Manufacturer stuff. Was there anything else I had to share? Oh, obviously Black Friday flash deals, and then I put that game programmer course up. The coupon for that I think it's just Cyber, and it should automatically apply. It goes 50% and 50% off. Yeah. So hey, Thomas, you gotta come join us sometime live. It'll be a fun chat. So any final words before we go? Oh, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Yeah, I'm forgetting all these things. I need notes for everybody to know what to talk about.
Like YouTuber outro script.
Yeah, I got rear-ended a couple days ago, and I've been a little bit out of it and keep forgetting stuff. That's
One more thing I think I may want to bring up, like really shortly.
Yeah.
I've recently been looking at the Unity localization package, and I just want to say it's a great package. So just to call it out.
I haven't seen this
I
one.
admit we're still using i2 in our projects, but yeah, it looks pretty good.
So yeah, it has a lot of stuff that I would consider necessary for localizing your game. I recently watched Thomas's stream, and he was using strings at one point, and I asked about it. So I was thinking about this package at the time. That said, Thomas's streams really have a ton of value. I really recommend looking into it, especially if you're actually trying to ship game product.
Yeah, like I think I said
a job with it.
I think I said earlier, I don't think anybody is doing as good of a job talking about the marketing aspect of games. I don't think there's anybody right now giving you as much of a like legitimately you have to think about this stuff kind of dialogue, you know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, he's definitely the best person I know at that stuff by far. Oh, last thing. The Dev Creator Day is coming up in San Francisco on the 7th, or is it the 8th? I know it's coming up soon. Andrew said he was going, so sounds like fun in 1 week. All right, well, I've got to get going. My door just broke down with the dog, so I guess we'll see everybody next week. And hopefully everybody has fun. Don't forget to like, subscribe, go check out Jason Story's Ko-fi page, and join the Discord for all the fun discussions that are going on throughout the week that they've been missing out. And obviously subscribe to Pal's channel, play some Terraria, and I link the Nature Manufacturer assets a bunch of times. So, all right, we will see everybody next week. Thanks again for coming out, and bye everybody. Where's my button? I'm not going to be able to find the button. Oh, I collapsed the goodbye button. All right, bye.